So I'm going to introduce our two speakers, and then I'm going to sit down, and then we're going to hear from them, and then I'm going to ask them a couple of questions, and then I'll throw it open to the floor. So as most of you know, I'm sure, Nick Gibb is the Minister of State for School Standards. He was elected 20 years ago, and between 1997 and 2001, he held various roles, including frontbench spokesman on trade and industry and on the Treasury, but he became a shadow minister for education in 2005 and has stayed with the education brief ever since. He was appointed by the Prime Minister in 2010 to become Minister of State and served until 2012, where there was a very brief hiatus, and then he returned to post, and then Theresa May made him Minister for School Standards. And he was appointed to the Privy Council in November of last year. Rod is the president for core markets for Pearson. Core markets include those 100+ countries with, in general, developed economies and education systems. And in 2010, Rod became president for Pearson UK and was appointed to lead all other core markets for Pearson in January 2014. And he's worked in education, publishing and assessment for universities and schools for over 30 years. So Rod, do you want to kick us off? Am I kicking off, or is I think Nick. Will you be John the Baptist?
Yes. Thank you. I think Rod then wants to criticise everything I've said, so he can't do that until I've actually said it. Well, thank you very much, Toby, and thank you to Policy Exchange for hosting this opportunity for me to say something about our education policy. Policy Exchange has been one of the most influential think tanks for the past 15 years, and the origin really of much important legislation since 2010. And in no policy area is that more true than in education, where the work of Sam Friedman, Jonathan Simons and Natasha Porter, amongst others, has been instrumental in nurturing the free school revolution and raising expectations for what it's possible to achieve. But Policy Exchange hasn't simply focused on structures, from work inspired by the great E.D. Hirsch on implementing a knowledge-rich curriculum to the groundwork for the pupil premium and work exposing the pernicious grade inflation that so badly undermined public confidence in our education system during the last Labour government. Policy Exchange has been key to the government's education reforms. And under the inspired and committed leadership of John Blake, standing at the back, this work is continuing. For example, the joint project with Mark Lehane of Parents and Teachers for Excellence, exploring the benefits of a knowledge-rich curriculum, is hugely exciting. And your recent work, John, with my old boss, Nicky Morgan, on character and resilience, addresses a really important issue that can too easily be overlooked. And I know that there's more in the pipeline. And John, your radicalism and work will not be wasted, because under this government, and I might add this Minister for Schools, our restless determination to improve the life chances of millions of children in England's state schools is still as strong today as it was in 2010, and there is much more still to do. Toby, a strong education system is crucial for two principal reasons. First, a strong education system is the foundation of a strong economy and a strong society. And the importance of education to economic strength is well known. In the English and Their History by Robert Toombs, he notes that in advance of the Industrial Revolution in the second half of the 18th century, foreign visitors to our country remarked on the high levels of literacy amongst British people from all classes in society, and the dominance in the international education rankings by Shanghai, Singapore, and South Korea has coincided with their booming economic growth. As important is the role that education plays in creating a cohesive society. As E.D. Hirsch has argued, and I quote, "We will be able to achieve a just and prosperous society only when our schools ensure that everyone commands enough shared knowledge to be able to communicate effectively with everyone else. A well-rounded, knowledge-rich education gives pupils an introduction into what Matthew Arnold described in Culture and Anarchy in 1869 as the best which has been thought and said. Education helps us see the humanity in Shakespeare's Shylock, inspires us with the mysteriousness of the quantum and the majesty of Beethoven and Handel. The knowledge we gain serves as an introduction to the conversation of mankind and can emancipate us from everyday parochialism. But despite the importance of education, over the last 60 years, we have seen a steady but remorseless decline in standards in England and other parts of the West, where education has been dominated by a progressive ideology, an ideology that rejects the importance of knowledge, that's hostile to didactic teacher-led instruction. It's against remembering facts and deeply opposed to testing and exams. And while this approach took hold in the West, the international rankings have been dominated by countries from Asia where the grip of this progressive educational doctrine has yet to gain a stranglehold. Now, the roots of educational progressivism lie with Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his romantic treatise Émile. From its opening line, which declares that everything is good as it leaves the hands of the author of things, everything degenerates in the hands of man. Rousseau rails against traditional methods of education, believing that education should focus more on a child's interaction with the world. And the romanticism of this tale, with the child unencumbered by the supposed prejudices of his teacher, has appealed to the political left over 2 centuries. And this view still persists amongst some today. For example, at the Wellington Festival earlier this year, detentions used to sanction poor behaviour were described as violence done to pupils by teachers. And over the last quarter of a millennium, Émile has influenced and inspired progressives, social constructivists, and leftists of all stripes as they seek to redesign society according to their will, to the detriment of children's life chances. And interestingly, what is often forgotten by those influenced by the romanticism of Rousseau's ideas is that he abandoned his own son to a poorhouse. And when a decade later he made inquiries as to his whereabouts, he found no trace. The history of the progressive doctrine of education is littered with failure, but this hasn't stopped proponents searching for a reason to force their educationally regressive dogma onto schools to the detriment of pupils. And foremost amongst these efforts is the attempt to use the Finnish example as evidence. Finland, which topped the first PISA rankings in 2000, is often cited as an example of a Western country that has bucked the trend, providing evidence to support the progressive ideology. And the example of Finland is misused in England to justify a skills-based curriculum, to attack testing, and to reduce the role of the teacher. But a more careful analysis of the Finnish example actually helps to explain the relative decline of Western education systems. And Gabriel Salgren, analysing the international success of Finland at the turn of the millennium, found that a closer examination of Finland's results over time reveals that it began well before most of the progressive policies were able to take effect. In fact, he concludes that Finland's comparatively late development in terms of industrialization and economic growth meant that Finnish culture and education remained more traditional, similar to high-performing systems in Southeast Asian nations. And Salgren argues that this culture meant that a hierarchical and traditional schooling climate remained largely in place until relatively recently. And it is this that is likely to have underpinned the country's improvements in international tests. And he calls this the wealth effect, which first increases and then later decreases educational performance as a function of income. And as Finland moved away from traditional teaching methods and towards so-called progressive or child-initiated education, it has begun to fall down the international league tables, albeit from a high base. Now, this wealth effect should concern those looking to improve education in England and the West, because once a certain level of wealth is reached in a country, the country begins to move away from the education methods that have worked and towards the alluring romanticism of progressivism. From the 1967 Plowden Review, the dismissal of the Black Papers, published between 1969 and 1977, the rejection of Callaghan's encroachment into the secret garden, the subsequent capture of the national curriculum, through to the use of Ofsted to enforce a progressive teaching style, England's rejection of education common sense in favour of romanticism is well established. And that's why the Conservative reforms from 2010 onwards are so significant, challenging these prevailing progressive orthodoxies. Our reforms centre on two Conservative principles. First, drawing heavily on the work of Policy Exchange, the government embarked on a programme of decentralisation, removing power from ideological proponents of progressivism and placing it in the hands of teachers and head teachers. And by granting greater autonomy, combined with an intelligent accountability system, school-level decision has been localised, reducing the influence of the bureaucratic middle tier and giving control back to the front line, allowing parents greater choice for their children. Secondly, the government undid Labour's reckless and damaging changes to the national curriculum and qualifications, and we reintroduced rigour into English schools. So by 2010, when we came into power, a change in direction was badly needed. At that time, schools were shepherding pupils disproportionately from disadvantaged backgrounds into taking so-called equivalent qualifications to inflate the school's rankings in the league tables. The growth of equivalents coincided with a sharp decline in the take-up of some highly valued academic subjects, including foreign languages. Grade inflation was rife, with a D grade in 1996 equivalent to a C grade by 2010. And the 2007 skills-based national curriculum was denying pupils the core knowledge and cultural capital they needed to be successful and to be able to contribute to society. So by 2010, there was a clamour for a return to the fundamentals of a classical liberal education for all pupils, not just those whose parents could afford to send them to independent schools or afford an address in the right catchment area. And parents were rightly disillusioned with the unfulfilled promises of politicians and educationalists to improve standards. So we rewrote the primary curriculum. And in the face of bitter opposition from some education academics, we insisted on long division being taught in primary schools and long multiplication in year 5 and fractions from the start. We insisted all pupils know their multiplication tables by the end of year 4. And what next in our reform programme? Well, we're currently working on a computer-based and timed multiplications tables check for all year 4 pupils that will be rolled out in 2019 and 2020. And what a prize it will be when every child leaves primary school fluently and effortlessly able to recall their times tables up to 12 times 12. We made phonics statutory in the national curriculum and introduced a short test at the end of year 1 to check that all 6-year-olds could decode words and were on track to become fluent readers. In 2012, just 58% of 6-year-olds reached the expected standard in the test. This year, 81% did so. So what next? Well, we want that 81% to rise further. We already know that with the retake that pupils have to do if they don't pass it in year 2, we're reaching 92% being able to decode. So we know there is scope to ensure that ever more children can be successful in early reading. And that's why the Secretary of State on Sunday spoke about an increased focus on literacy in the reception year. We rewrote the secondary school curriculum and reformed GCSEs, restoring rigour, removing modules, ending the retake culture, and restoring the GCSE to end-of-course exams. We gave Ofqual, the exams regulator, a new duty to ensure that GCSEs and A-levels were on a par with those in other countries, including the very highest performing nations. What next? Well, we're only part of the way through rolling out the new, more rigorous GCSEs and A-levels. It's taken 7 years to get us to this point, so we'll now focus on ensuring these new qualifications are successful and are well taught. We commissioned Professor Alison Wolfe to scrutinise all the so-called equivalent qualifications that schools were entering some of their pupils for instead of GCSEs, particularly those pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds. She removed 96% of them. And the vocational qualifications that now remain carry real value. So what next? Well, we're reforming and improving a qualification called functional skills. This is for those students over the age of 16 who are still on their way to achieving a standard pass in English and Maths GCSE. We want to ensure that every young person leaves our education system as literate and numerate. These are the bare essentials for survival in a modern world and a demanding economy. We gave teachers more power to tackle unruly behaviour, restoring control of the classroom to the adult. We guaranteed teachers anonymity if they're faced with allegations from parents and pupils. What next? Well, we commissioned Tom Bennett to produce a report on behaviour management best practice, which has now been published, and we want to highlight successful practice in schools, such as the outstanding free school Michaela Community School in Brent. We rewrote the teachers' standards, against which teacher training is measured and against which teachers are performance managed throughout their careers, bringing a new emphasis to the importance of subject knowledge, behaviour management, and the centrality of courteous behaviour, and for primary teachers, a clear understanding of phonics. So what next? Well, we are considering ways to further enhance the professional status of teachers through reforms to the QTS process. We introduced the new performance measure, the English Baccalaureate, the EBAC, which is a combination of the core academic GCSEs of English, maths, at least 2 sciences, either history or geography, and a foreign language, holding schools to account for the proportion of their pupils entered for and achieving this combination, including a language, the study of which had plummeted following Labour's decision in 2004 to remove the compulsion to study a language to GCSE. So what next? Well, we've just announced that we expect almost all pupils to be taking the EBAC with a timetable of 75% to be studying for the EBAC by 2022 and 90% by 2025. Work by the Sutton Trust in 2015 demonstrated that just 12% of highly able but disadvantaged pupils attended a secondary school offering triple science, just 12%. And these are highly able children. And we know that disadvantaged pupils are less likely to be entered into the EBAC combination of GCSEs than similarly able pupils from more affluent backgrounds. We think that's unjust, and we think the EBAC policy will address that injustice. In the 1970s, textbooks were regarded as old-fashioned and unprogressive. In a wave of educational vandalism, tons of high-quality textbooks were sent to landfill or the bonfire. And we have led the way in making the case for the use of high-quality textbooks in our schools. In countries with high-performing education systems, such as Singapore, textbooks play a key role. And a study by Tim Oates found that in Singapore, 70% of maths teachers use a textbook as a basis for instruction. In England, alas, in 2014, only 10% of maths teachers use a textbook for their core teaching, and in science, just 4%. So what next? Well, we've announced £41 million for maths hubs, promoting the use of Southeast Asian approaches to maths teaching, including the use of maths textbooks. Our structural reforms have given freedom to academies and free schools, where decision-making has been truly localised, freeing the school from the progressive orthodoxies and low expectations that dominate the education departments of too many local authorities. And whether you look at Reach Academy Feltham, Michaela Community School in Brent, City Academy Hackney, King Solomon Academy, or Harris Academy Battersea, there are some obvious similarities. All these schools teach a stretching, knowledge-rich curriculum. Each has a strong approach to behaviour management, so teachers can teach uninterrupted. And all of these schools serve disadvantaged communities, demonstrating that high academic and behavioural standards are not and must not be the preserve of wealthy pupils in independent schools, as many on the left would have you believe. And yet, these schools' first GCSE results this summer exceeded nearly everyone's wildest expectations. And free schools are disproportionately making a difference to the lives of disadvantaged pupils. There are 3 times as many free schools in England's most deprived areas as there are in the least deprived. Secondary free schools educate an above-average number of pupils eligible for the pupil premium. Ark Conway Primary Academy opened in Acton in 2011. It achieved the best Key Stage 1 results in England in 2014 and 2015, outperforming England's 15,000 state primaries, as well as some private schools. Tawhid al-Islam Boys High School in Blackburn achieved the third best Progress 8 score in the country last year, and 73% of the pupils achieved the English baccalaureate compared to a national average of 23%. And I could list a whole raft of examples like that in free schools around the country. And this is what the Free Schools programme is delivering. And it would not have happened without a Conservative government. It was opposed by the left, opposed by Labour, opposed by the educational progressives. So what next? We plan to create hundreds more free schools and to continue to convert more local authority schools to academies. And our mission is to ensure that all corners of the country benefit from the innovation offered by high-performing academy chains and free schools. And despite the progress made in the last 7 years to spread opportunity across the country, there are still too many areas of the country where pupil achievement is too low. So our reforms over the last 7 years are working. This year, 150,000 more 6-year-olds are on track to becoming fluent readers than in 2012. The proportion of pupils studying the EBAC has risen from a fifth in 2010 to 2/5 last year. The attainment gap between disadvantaged pupils and their more affluent peers has shrunk by 7% since 2011 at Key Stage 4 and by 9.3% at Key Stage 2. 7 years on, the public conversation about education is changing. The work of Dame Rachel D'Souza at the Inspiration Trust to attract curriculum experts such as Christine Council and Michael Fordham demonstrates that knowledge-rich curricula are back at the heart of schooling. And Emma Leonard and Toby Young are creating popular knowledge-rich lesson plans for primary schools. And there is now a vibrant and growing international community of teacher bloggers who are challenging the old progressive orthodoxy. And whilst, and perhaps most significantly of all, the reading wars are beginning to be won. And whilst consensus is still some way off, there is important cross-party agreement on this important issue. For example, the excellent work of the Labour Mayor, Sir Robin Wales, to transform Newham, one of the capital's poorest boroughs, into one of the best places in the country to be taught to read. This year, 89% of its 6-year-olds passed the phonics screening check, compared to the national average of 81%, and compared to 78% in more prosperous Brighton and Hove. But the battle of ideas never ceases. The opponents of what we stand for never sleep. As Conservatives, we have to continue to make the case for our policies. We are winning the argument in favour of a knowledge-rich curriculum. We are winning the reading wars, and parents are voting with their feet in support of free schools. But we mustn't stop putting our arguments and engaging in debate. The battle of ideas in education, as on the economy, is never won. And as each generation passes, we need to explain the fundamental principles and ideas that underpin our policies. The belief that all children, whatever their background, deserve to be taught a core body of knowledge, that it's never acceptable to deny a child the opportunity to learn because of where they've come from, that giving parents choice over good schools, over good quality schools, is always better than letting the state decide where and how a child should be educated, that regular testing is an important part of the learning process, helping to ensure children remember what they've been taught, and that periodic external assessment is important in holding schools to account for the quality of the education they provide, that academic rigour, good discipline, and high expectations are not just for the elite, but for all. These are at the heart of what we believe as Conservatives. And it's the power of our ideas, not just a collection of seemingly isolated policies, that will ensure the Conservative Party's future and win the support of young as well as older voters. On the economy, our careful husbandry of the public finances isn't driven by parsimony, but by an understanding of how a successful economy works. We know that we can only fund our annual budget deficit and accumulated national debt by giving confidence to the creditors who fund them that we have a plan to clear our debts and eliminate the deficit over time. We know the damage and injustice that inflation causes to an economy, And we know that delivering low inflation and low unemployment are key policy objectives that have eluded generations of governments in the past, but not this government, with its careful and balanced approach to managing the economy and the public finances. We know that ownership and the aspiration to own is one of the most fundamental and powerful drivers of individual and social progress. To own a home and to have the security of a pension and other savings is an essential underpinning of personal freedom. We believe in choice over direction, and that everyone, whatever their background, must have the opportunities to succeed. We know the power of the free market to innovate and provide ever more exciting products and services. We also know that markets without competition can fail consumers. The essence of conservatism is to reject those ideas that experience and history have shown to fail, and to espouse ideas that the evidence says provides the greatest good to the greatest number of people. We are not theorists. We are practical people. We cherish what works, and we protect our institutions, from the National Health Service to the monarchy. These are the principles that are at the heart of our successful education reforms. They are the principles that I believe will ensure the Conservative Party's future and our nation's success. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. Thank you, John, and Policy Exchange as well, for giving me the opportunity as one of the sort of representatives, if you like, of one of the participants in education and in the education reforms that Nick has spoken so eloquently about of the last 7 years, to give a bit of a perspective on what that's felt like and some of the things that we've done and how we have involved and engaged ourselves in it. I think the very first thing I'd like to say is that when Michael Gove, as Secretary of State for Education, and Nick Gibb, as Schools Minister, took their posts in 2010, and as we began to engage and to listen, we really became very enthusiastic about the opportunity. In fact, I'd say we were fired with enthusiasm. I certainly felt that way, and not just because, had we not been fired with enthusiasm, we might have been concerned that we might have been fired with enthusiasm. Quite honestly, this was something we could see that was driven. We had ministers who really cared about what they were doing and were really driving for a much more ambitious agenda. I myself was new in my role at that time in 2010, just having taken responsibility for EdXL, of course, one of the three main awarding bodies in the UK. So we saw the opportunity to participate in raising the bar. We ourselves established something we called internally an expert panel to focus on what we called world-class qualifications. We appointed external experts, including people like Sally Coates from Burlington Danes, also from Singapore, Professor Sing Kong Lee from the National Institute of Education. And we said to these people, we will not invest a single penny and take any new qualifications to schools or colleges in this country unless you give your endorsement that you believe that these qualifications have been developed to world-class principles, and those principles being around world-class standards, benchmark standards, rigorous assessments, inclusive and empowering qualifications for all young people. We made that commitment, and indeed they did endorse every single qualification we developed. With regard to vocational qualifications, we took the decision to introduce external assessment into our BTEC Level 2 qualifications in schools a year before it was mandated by government that all vocational qualifications should include external assessments. But I think above all, what we've now begun to realise as we've, along with our colleagues in the other awarding organisations, is that there's a really great need now for us to also engage in supporting teaching and teachers, because, of course, in the end, it's what teachers do in classrooms every day that has the greatest impact on learning. So we are turning our attention increasingly to the support that we can give to teachers and to great teaching to ensure that teachers have very good understanding of the standards and the way that qualifications work, and are able to deliver them without going down the road of assuming that every test is something that needs to be taught to. But actually, you can teach in ways that deliver great outcomes without doing that. We've also recognised in a world where there's much greater pressure on the whole system, that not all awarding organisations are wanting to offer all qualifications. We actually picked up a number of minority languages from other awarding organisations, but we did these things because we really do recognise that in any system of education, it's a large and complex undertaking, that there is no one stakeholder that can do everything, that essentially this has to be a collaborative effort. Stakeholders have to work together: teachers, awarding organisations, government, teacher training and recruitment organisations have to work together to that common purpose. And that common purpose is critical. It is something that, in being a participant in, of course, we don't just do whatever we're asked to do. We also need to stand up and say what we think. We need to be able to stand up and engage and sometimes have disagreements in order that we can get to a better outcome. I can see as I look forward that the agenda that we really want to engage in going forward includes what's happening in schools, but goes beyond that as well in the world of technical education. There is a very, very ambitious, and rightly a very ambitious, agenda under this government for improving technical education in this country. It's an area that probably for 150 years we've not done a good enough job in. And it really is crucially important. I think, though, as we embrace the technical education agenda, it's very important that we don't needlessly bifurcate education into, you're either going to have a technical education that gets you a job, or you're going to have an academic education that gets you to university. Actually, the world is more complex and more nuanced than that, and most universities themselves have an incredibly important role to play in skills and technical education. In fact, they are incredibly important participants in technical education, and we need to develop a curriculum and pathways that enable people to go through level 3, the kind of age 16, 18, all the way through 4, 5, before getting to level 6 to a degree, that gives them a pathway that is perhaps not purely academic, nor purely technical in terms of occupational, but perhaps gives them exposure to a more career-based education, that gives them exposure to the benefits of understanding what it's like to be a technologist, not just to be a technician. And that means that as we look forward at the whole technical and skills agenda, I'm very keen to ensure that we don't ignore the fact there are probably three pathways we need to consider. There is the occupational route. There is the route that takes you to a job, and probably doesn't take you directly to university. Perhaps you can go to university after you've done a job for a while if you wish, but it takes you directly to a job. There is that pathway that they embrace in Singapore, which is a more career education, as they call it in Singapore, for technologists, not technicians. And then there is also the broader academic pathway. And all of these pathways give you knowledge, but they also give you skills. The skills for an occupation, the skills for a career, the skills for the broader academic skills that also enable you to do well in certain careers. These are the sort of skills that we are seeing. This breadth of skills are going to be very important as jobs in the future change. We in Pearson have just worked collaboratively with Nesta and the University of Oxford to produce a report on employment in 2030. And that report says that actually contrary to some of the popular beliefs that robots are going to take the world over and everyone's jobs are going to be destroyed by robots, actually probably there could be as many as 1 in 5 jobs that get affected by artificial intelligence and automation negatively. Some of those jobs that are more repetitive, that require fewer of the cognitive skills, they are the ones that are likely to decline in this country. The jobs, though, that are likely to grow are those that involve services, interpersonal skills, including teaching. Teaching is a growth profession, according to this report, and will be a bigger and more important profession in 2030. And all of the other jobs, so there's probably about 60 or 70% of jobs that won't disappear but will change. And the kinds of skills that people need to do those jobs will also change as automation increases. So that's an agenda which is incredibly important for the future. Anybody that wants to have a look at that report will find it at futureskills.pearson.com. But whilst that future agenda is very important, implementing the current agenda is equally important. We are by no means through. There is a lot more work to do. We're just midway through launching many of the new qualifications. There's a lot more work to do in schools to support great teaching and to take forward the agenda to raise standards much in the way that the Minister has outlined. Thank you.
Is this on or do I need to switch it on?
Hi. Nick, I meant to say at the beginning that you have been a champion of systematic synthetic phonics, and that was opposed for a long time by the Rousseauian left, the progressive left, and actually that children were condemned for many years to subpar literacy standards in schools because of that ideological opposition. You faced it down, and partly because of your championing of synthetic phonics. I think there are now 150,000 fewer 6-year-olds in primary schools who are, 150,000 more 6-year-olds in primary schools who are on track to become fluent readers than there were in 2012. Did you discover synthetic phonics via Hirsch, or did you discover Hirsch via phonics?
No, the phonics issue came from my discovery of the Read and Reform Foundation, and from that the Collect Manager study, and I knew, we all knew in 2007-8 that there was progressive education was causing underperforming schools, and it was the cause of an underperforming education system. But even under John Major, people like Emily Blatch, there was no clear, I didn't feel, a clear intellectual explanation of what progressive education was and how it was causing damage. And I started to explore these issues, discovered the Read and Reform Foundation, and realized instantly that phonics was the low-hanging fruit in the battle with progressive educational ideas. And then when I met the Read and Reform Foundation people, Debbie Hepplewhite, and so on, and Ruth Miskin, I discovered the Collect Manager study done by St Andrews and Hull University, and there was a 7-year longitudinal study that absolutely showed how effective it was in teaching children to read. And then from that, one then started to explore more idea setting and streaming and so on, and then that led to Hirsch and the knowledge-based curriculum.
I wanted to follow up by asking one of the ways in which I think secondary schools have been steered towards teaching a more knowledge-rich curriculum is via the EBAC, which, as we know, is going to become mandatory for 75% of schools in 2022, and then 90% of schools in 2025, pupils in year 10. Is there an equivalent device, mechanism, to encourage primary schools not to neglect the foundation subjects and science, which they do for the most part because the children are only tested in numeracy and literacy at the end of Key Stage 2?
Yes, I hope there is. I mean, I keep making the point that the way to do well in the reading tests and the SATs is not to keep doing more and more comprehension tests, because comprehension tests just tests your level of comprehending, it doesn't improve your level of comprehending. The way to improve comprehension is by getting children to read more, to improve their vocabulary, and the better their vocabulary, the more they'll be able to understand when they read, and the more challenging books they'll be able to read. The more challenging books they'll be able to read, the better comprehension. And so that's the message we try to convey to schools. This test is designed to assess how much children have read, not how many comprehension tests they've taken. Secondly, there is a case, and it's something that I'm thinking about whether the non-fiction section of the reading test in the SAT can relate to the curriculum subjects that ought to have been taught in the 5 years, the science curriculum in particular. So the words that will be used, whether it's octopus or the humble potato, you know that they will have come from the curriculum that's in the national curriculum, and that does give schools an extra incentive to teach those knowledge subjects.
Okay. I'm going to ask you one question, Rod, and then I'm going to throw it open to the floor. My question for you is, which aspects do you think of the reforms that Nick and other ministers in the department have successfully implemented would be at risk if there's a Labour government? What might Labour try and reverse? What might Labour leave in place, do you think? What's reversible?
That's a terribly unfair question. Actually, I think it would be very hard to unwind the reforms that are in place. I think for any government, in the sense that I think they've gained credibility. There are lots of people that perhaps complain about the way they're being implemented or the impact on, focus on testing, teaching to the test. These are important issues. And you hear terms used like exam factories and what have you. But these are issues largely of implementation. No one's saying that we shouldn't have rigorous testing that I've heard. No one's saying that knowledge is not important that I've heard. I think it would be pretty difficult to row back radically from where we are today. But I do think that the only way to get it really embedded and entrenched so that it becomes truly irreversible is when we have even more evidence of the impact, that things are really working. So I suspect there may be a period of vulnerability for another few years until that evidence is so well understood that it would be impossible to go back on.
Okay, thank you. Who has a question? Yes, do we have a microphone? So wait for the microphone and then introduce yourself. Lady in the front row.
Hi, Karen Westbeezer from NFER. I enjoyed your speech, but I thought that there were 3 key areas that were missing that are very important to schools and to teachers at the moment. Accountability systems, teacher recruitment and retention, and school funding. It's quite late in the day, so I'm not going to ask you to address all of those, but I wondered if you'd like to choose at least one of those to talk about.
Well, school funding has been a clear issue. We have introduced a national funding formula. We've added £1.3 billion to the total quantum in that funding formula. And I think now we have a settled issue for 2018-19 and 2019-20. And we're helping schools. So every school will see an increase. Underfunded schools will see significant increases of at least 3% a year. And schools that are really, really underfunded, those are securing less than 4,600 in 2018 or 4,800 in 2019 in secondary, will see their funding go up to those levels, which could be more than 3%. So I think we have, tackled some entrenched historic unfairnesses in our funding system. Recruitment's very difficult when you have a very strong economy, lowest unemployment for over 40 years. That's a great achievement for an economy, but it does bring with it pressures, not just in teaching, but in other sectors of society, of the economy that needs graduates. And it isn't exclusive to Britain either. There are other countries around the world that also struggle to recruit enough high-quality graduates into teaching. But we're doing everything we can with very generous tax-free bursaries of up to £25,000 in some subjects to recruit the best graduates into teaching. We continue to do that. Accountability, I think we do need to have a strong accountability system. And sorry for pronouncing your name wrong on every occasion I meet you, so I'm not even going to try saying your name this time. I think accountability is important. OECD says that the best education systems in the world combine autonomy with strong accountability. And we only have accountability points really at the end of primary and at the end of Key Stage 4. Those are the two key accountability points. I do think sometimes we, as policymakers, sometimes put too much pressure on head teachers and teachers to get over a floor standard. And I think that I've visited probably 500 schools since 2003, and I only generally meet conscientious, well-educated, hard-working professionals who want to do the best for their children in their school. Where those schools fail, it's generally because of the curriculum and pedagogy and all the issues we've been discussing today. And I think it's better to have a discussion about those issues than to do more than to put increasing football managers type pressure onto head teachers of schools. That's where I would like the debate to shift. And of course you need accountability, and you need to have schools publishing their Key Stage 2 results and their GCSE results. But I think the mere publication of those results is the pressure that will raise standards. I don't think, my personal view is that's where the pressure should rest.
Yeah, just to perhaps add to the points on accountability, I very much agree with what you've said about the amount of pressure. But equally, I think it's true that we shouldn't underestimate the degree to which school leaders have the ability themselves to respond to that pressure in different ways. There isn't always one way to respond to that pressure. So, for example, I'm very proud of the fact my daughter's just started teaching, and the school, which is a very good school that she's teaching in, has been very clear with all of the teaching staff that the national curriculum test is a test of the teachers, not of the children, and that they should not be passing that on to the children. In fact, if anything, they should be saying to the children, this is not a test that you should be worrying about. Almost treat it like some sort of like a quiz, because the test is of whether the teachers have taught the curriculum, not of the children. Now, I don't know how many schools do that. I was very impressed when I found out, but I don't think necessarily all schools react the same way. And I think there are important issues of leadership and culture and lessons to be learned in that area. And I think that's another area for debate.
Another question? Yes, gentleman here. Just wait for the mic, if you would.
Thank you very much, Nicholas Heslop. I'm here as a delegate. I'm the leader of a local authority in West Kent, Tunbridge and Morling. But as the Minister knows, I also work for Lord Baker at the Edge Foundation. So I was very interested in your speech, very passionate. You hold very strong views. But as the Schools Minister, you didn't make any mention of T-levels. You didn't make any mention of apprenticeships, which are two ladders of opportunity for young people. And we as a Conservative Party need to be talking to young people. The introduction of EBAC has seen a consequence of D&T the take-up of D&T going down by 24%. What are we going to do to encourage young people to take up T-levels and apprenticeships?
Well, I thought my speech was long enough as it was. I could have gone on to talk about T-levels. They are a wonderful consequence of the Sainsbury review, the 15 routes. I think it's going to be clearer for those who want to pursue a post-16 non-academic, non-A-level route. It's been much clearer once the T-levels are developed fully, and we have a clearer system. People will know much better. In the way that academic routes are clear, it'll be much clearer once that system is in place. Apprenticeships have been a great success of our reforms, 3.5 million new apprenticeships created so far. I don't accept what you say about design and technology. Those numbers were falling before we introduced the EBAC performance measure. And they were falling because of a dissatisfaction with the curriculum in design and technology at GCSE. So we have reformed the GCSE, design and technology GCSE, working with the Dyson Foundation. It is a very high quality GCSE now, and I'm relatively confident that once that is properly up and running as a GCSE, we will see numbers start to rise. But the fall is not because of the EBAC. It was falling before the EBAC. Also, we've kept the EBAC small in order to allow people to, I mean, it's compulsory anyway to the end of Key Stage 3 design and technology. But after when children start Key Stage 4, we want them to do the EBAC. We kept the EBAC small enough so that those that want to do music or want to do design and technology, that want to do a second foreign language, who want to do a vocational subject, there will be space to do that in addition to the EBAC. But we shouldn't underestimate the importance to social mobility of children studying a core academic curriculum up until the age of 16. It's commonplace in other countries around the world. In fact, in some countries around the world, you do that to 18. And if you believe in social mobility, then the EBAC is a key deliverer of social mobility.
How do you think T-levels will fit together with the BTEC stuff that you do?
I tried to talk about that a bit earlier. I mean, I am a governor of a UTC, and yeah, but I'm a governor of a UTC, and so it's an agenda which I personally believe is incredibly important. I think let's not forget that there are opportunities to move into more technical or practical pathways also at level 3. So, you know, at age 16, not just at age 14, there are opportunities to do that at age 16. And the way the structure of schools works, it's more conducive to students moving into those pathways at age 16. And the UTC that I'm a governor is collaborating with a local multi-academy trust to ensure that more students in that multi-academy trust will have access to the courses that the UTC is able to put on at age 16 for level 3. So I think that's something to be optimistic about in the context of potentially of multi-academy trusts. To the question around T-levels and BTECs, I think there is a risk of very simple, even simplistic bifurcation between job-related education and university-related education. There are many opportunities for students to take at level 3 a much broader but still quite career-focused program of education. If you look at Singapore, they have 3 pathways post-16. They have the junior college A-level route, they have the Polytechnic Institute route, which is more similar to a BTEC, and then they have the Institute of Technical Education, which is more like a T-level route. The cohort splits according to choices which are made by students in that country. That works extremely well. I would advocate strongly for 3 pathways rather than 2 for that reason, but nevertheless, I think the focus on technical education is overdue and much needed.
Another question? The gentleman with the red tie in row 3.
Thank you. Dominic Swan from Hornchurch and Upminster. First of all, my congratulations on probably one of the best ministerial speeches of conference. It's really rare to find someone who's got obviously built up technical and subject knowledge as well as aspiration. A particular question. You've clearly done a lot of work on the standards for grades at call it the O and A level for want of modern terminology. But that's dependent on keeping pressure from the top. Because when you have a system of competing standards bodies essentially being picked by schools, there's an intrinsic bias in the system to effectively to seek market share. Have you considered an environment where when you bring in new exams, such as the back, where you get a chance to reset the percentages in different pass grades, where you actually fix those, so you have a certain percentage getting, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, and then essentially it's the schools who have to compete to get access to those high grades by delivering the best education standard.
That's a very good. Thank you for your kind comments. My first school was in Hornchurch, Langton's infant school. The point about competing exam boards having a systemic incentive to compete for market share amongst schools by hinting at and slowly reducing standards over a period of time is something that we have been worried about. And Rod and I have discussed this at length. And there was a proposal during the last Parliament, well, Parliament before last, to have one exam board. And, he's gone now, the former chairman of the Select Committee was not happy with it. And there were arguments against it at the time, particularly as we were busy reforming the GCSEs at a time, and then to ask the exam boards to merge. I think it would be too much for the system to bear. But we keep this issue under review the whole time. In terms of your basically calling for a normative grading system, and I think I've often thought that was a good system. I worry about it though, because it's fine for English and maths, because everyone takes English and maths, but it doesn't work if you have subjects like Latin that are disproportionately sat by more able children. And to say that only 5% can get A's means that the bright children just wouldn't take the risk of taking Latin. And so you have to have a criterion-based, I think, approach to grading because of that argument.
Or you would give the exam board, a target of, say, for example, 4% grade A's, but not specify which subjects in which they fall.
Yes, there are other complexities that some of these subjects have such small entry levels that they're not viable, and sometimes I have to beg exam boards to continue to provide them. So there are interesting thoughts. It needs a lot of thought, because the fundamental issue that you raise is one that is still of concern to people.
The other difficulty with what you're proposing is that it doesn't allow for the possibility that children might genuinely improve. I mean, of course you want to guard against grade inflation, but you also don't want to make it impossible for children ever to actually produce evidence that the education system is improving. Another question. Yes, gentleman with the beard in the third row.
Thank you. Good evening, Minister. It's Mike Parker from Schools North East, which is a network of 1,300 schools across the North East. I'd like to echo some of the comment earlier about, in praise of your rigorous pursuit of standards. I think that whilst we might not agree with every element of it, I think it's a positive thing for the system. I wish you'd been able to take up our offer of speaking at our summit next week to 500 head teachers and explaining some of the work that you're doing, but I appreciate you may be busy. I wanted to ask you a question around social and cultural capital, because there's a concern in the North East that actually the absence of social and cultural capital is harming children's ability to engage with some of the exam system. And I cite one of our head teachers who talked about, in a particularly difficult school in the North East, working with children to get them excited about the exams and their prospects. They came out of an examination particularly pleased about one question that they really felt they'd nailed, which was answering a question that involved Oxford Circus. And they talked about the clowns and the balloons and, the lions and everything else. And they didn't actually have the cultural capital to engage with the question. Now, how do we instill that into children? And is that purely schools' responsibility, or how do you as a government address that we can try and get parents and wider society engaged in that?
It is a very good question, and it's, it is something I always worry about when when the Standards and Testing Agency set the SATs reading question. I'm not allowed to have any input into the exams, the tests that are taken, even though they're developed by an agency within the department. There's a very strict glass wall about test development. But I've always made it clear that the stories should not rely on knowledge of a particular thing. There should be no stories about horse riding or our trip to the Bahamas. They should be about things that everyone knows about, or they should be about something no one knows about. A trip to Venus or a trip to meeting monsters somewhere that no one can possibly know about. So that's a very important point. I absolutely understand that. However, I also believe that schools need to be helping children acquire that cultural capital. And one of the reasons I think that we perform poorly in the international tables for social resilience, if you like, where our background really does determine too much in this country compared to other OECD countries, the outcomes, both our income and our educational attainment. And I think part of that is we need to have more knowledge taught, and children need to be reading more throughout their school career. And I absolutely believe that is the answer to cultural capital. And it's no good saying, the parents should take them to the theatre. The parents should have books in the house, so let's send books to the parents. Ultimately the schools have to replicate. If we want to deal with social disadvantage and promote social mobility, We have to get the schools to do a lot of this work, I'm afraid. And that's why I believe strongly in children being read to from a very early, in the early years settings, to improve children's vocabulary. The vocabulary gap, the word gap, is a real issue of concern to the current Secretary of State. And the more they're read to in the early years, the more they're read to in primary school, the better their vocabulary will develop. And the more their vocabulary develops, the more they'll be able to read. And the more they'll be able to read, the more social and cultural capital they'll develop. There's no shortcut to it.
One solution, Rod, to this problem, and the problem in general of varying standards both between schools and within schools, would be at some point to phase out teachers and replace them by intelligent machines. Do you think that is a very distant prospect, or do you think can you see evidence of that beginning to happen already?
Personally, I don't think it's even a distant prospect. I just don't think it's going to happen. I think that, I think that machines, if you like, artificial intelligence and technology will increasingly be integrated into teaching, but the teachers will still be people. Whatever happens, they'll be using these technologies to find ways to engage, to measure, to better understand, but both to deliver, but also to better understand what it is that children are learning. I think technology has a very important role to play. But given the fact that learning is an endeavour that on the one hand you've got teaching, but on the other hand you've got learning. So learning is something the kids do themselves, and it's the interaction between the teacher and the student that is where the learning takes place. I can't believe that's going to be replaced by machines.
Famous last words. One more question, and that'll be our last question. Gentleman there, yes.
Thank you. Jonathan Gullis, delegate and a secondary school teacher. I was just quickly wondering, Minister, if after a lot of radical reforms, obviously to secondary state education and obviously to primary education, is there a radical reform to the early years? We've seen the 30 hours coming in, but obviously I don't know how many preschools there are currently in place, how many preschool teachers we have, or those going through the system. My wife works in that sector, and she would say there was a shortage, and I was hoping that there would be an expansion of that, because with the phonics programme, I think it has to start even before the primary age start at 5.
Yes, I think that we do need to do some work in the early years foundation stage, and the Secretary of State said on Sunday that we're going to look at an increased emphasis on maths and numeracy in the reception class, which is the final year of the early years foundation stage. And she is, as I've said, she's very determined to increase and to close the word gap between children from disadvantaged and advantaged families. And one of the ways to do that is in the early years settings. And my personal view is the children need to be read to once or twice a day in those schools. We need to have teachers in those settings talking to children, using vocabulary as a way of reducing that word gap, which is absolutely fundamental.
Any last words to add about the word gap, Rod, or should we call it a night?
I think we might call it a night. Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, Minister. That was an inspiring talk, and thank you, Rod, for your talk too.